It's amazing what they could do with makeup and a little editing, isn't it? That girl right down here, she said, that was you? No, absolutely not. That was not me. Man, aren't we thankful that God has an army? Man, I'm going to tell you something. God has an army, and we have an army of people who have incredible gifts and talents, and whatever your microphone is, our responsibility is to use it to share the love of Jesus Christ with other people. That's what it's all about. That's what we're going to talk about here in just a minute, and I want us to have a prayer together if we can before we jump in. Let's pray together. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, I want to thank you and praise you for the opportunity to be here today. I thank you for each and every one of these folks that have come here because of the gifts and the talents that you've given them, and they have a desire to use them and multiply them and share them with other people so that you can be made known to them. And Father, I thank you for the common bond that we have here in Jesus Christ. I thank you for the common bond that we have in the desire to use our gifts and talents to share with other people. And I'm so thankful for all the many different gifts and talents that are here. Lord, right now, I pray that you'd help me just to step aside. Help me, Lord, just to get out of your way. I pray that you would speak to me and through me, and that we would hear from you in these next few moments, Lord. We love you so very, very much, and we thank you and we praise you, Lord, for loving us first. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Jesus Christ's mother said, whatever he tells you to do, do it. You remember that? You remember when she said that? I mean, she had gone through this entire life with Jesus, raising him up to be the young man where he grew in wisdom and in stature and favor with God and man. And it got to the point where it actually was time for her to turn him over and say, your work here is done. It's time. My work here is done. It's time for you to go and do what you're going to do here. And whatever he tells you to do, do it. You remember when it was? I mean, it was at the wedding. It was at the very first miracle that he ever performed, the very first one that he ever did. And you know, one of the things I love about this passage is if you go on over in Mark, one of the things that Mark tells us is that nobody knows when Jesus is coming again. Not even the Son, but only the Father. Only God knows when he's going to say, okay, son, it's time. Go get him. Go get him, boy. Can't you just imagine what it must be like right now? I mean, you know, for God to be sitting on the throne and there's Jesus to the right. Is it time yet? Is it time yet? I mean, come on, let's fix this. Let's get this over with. And not even Jesus knows, only the Father. And I wonder what it must have been like 2,000 years ago, 2014 years ago, when Jesus was at the point where he was waiting for his time, when it was waiting for his time. And he gets to this wedding, this moment when it's about time. And actually what happens is these people come to him, and it's actually Jesus' mother comes to Jesus. And what she says to him is, they've run out of wine. And Jesus says to his mother, and you could interpret it the wrong way, but it's not a story. He doesn't say, why do you involve me, woman? He doesn't say that. He says, why do you involve me? And the reason he's asking the question is because he says, it's not my time. And wouldn't it be just like God? Wouldn't it be just like God to look down on Mary and say, Mary, I want you to be the one to tell him. I want you to be the one to reveal to Jesus, it's time. You be the one, because you've done such a phenomenal job of raising him up to grow in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. And so he looks at his mama and he says, why do you involve me? And she is so whelped up with emotion that she can't even answer him. She can't even begin to answer him. And so she just turns away from him and she looks at the servants that are there and she says, whatever he tells you to do, do it. I'm going to say the first part of that, and then I want you just to say, do it. Whatever he tells you to do, do it. He looked at the servants and he said, whatever he tells you to do, do it. Man, what a powerful message that was. Can I ask you a question? Has God ever asked you to do something? Not something that you thought you were supposed to do, but has God ever asked you to do something? And sometimes when God asks you to do something, you're going, wait a minute, me? You want me to do something? You know, one of the interesting things about this at that moment at the wedding, do you know the only people that got to see the water turn into wine were the servants? were the ones who decided to do whatever it was he told them to do. Everybody else out there going and doing their thing, but the servants came together, and when the servants did what they told them to do, they got to see the miracles. So you want to see the miracles of God? Be a servant of God. You want to be a servant of God? When you start to do the things that God tells you to do, you're going to get the opportunity to see those things. And I want to just tell you something. Every single one of us are on what I like to call the circle of ministry opportunity. Every single one of us are at a point where we're on the circle of ministry opportunity. I want to give you something very practical to take out of here today, because it's something that you're going to have to apply to your life. You're going to have to answer to. You got to answer these questions for you and you alone. I want you to take this with you. I just want you to think, if you have ever think of anything, the very first step on anything we've ever done, anything we've ever said, anything that ever had any kind of an impact whatsoever, have you ever seen anything at all that didn't begin with awareness? It all starts with awareness. We have to become aware of the things that are around us. And you know, the interesting thing about that is it comes in lots of different forms and formats. It comes to us in a lot of different ways. And I want to give you a quick story on when awareness hit me in the face for the very first time. I can remember when awareness hit me in the face for the very first time. I remember being called into the ministry, and when I got called into the ministry, I realized I had to go to college. I was really trying to skip that part, but I went to to Truett McConnell first, and then I went to University of Georgia, and I went to this junior college, got my degree, and so I'm on my way to Georgia, and most of the people that are at Georgia, and I was going into the Recreation and Leisure Department, the School of Education, and I'm going to get this degree in Recreation and Leisure, and I would walk in there, and I talked to my advisor, and they said, here's the deal. The vast majority of people in this major have been taking every single class together, and now they're in their final 2 years, and you're kind of coming in the middle of it. So what you want to do is you want to get you some pretty good friends pretty quick, because you're going to take every single class with this group. And I'm thinking, man, that is not cool for me. I'm not excited about that. And so this is what happened. I decided if I'm going to go into this very first class, I went in about 20 minutes early. There wasn't anybody in my first class in that first semester in my junior year of college at the University of Georgia. And I walked in, there's nobody there, and I'm strategically thinking this out. I'm thinking, I'm going to sit directly in the middle, because somebody's going to have to either sit in front of me, behind me, or to the left or the right. And so I sat down, and first of all, you're really some kind of a weirdo if you're 20 minutes early to a college class. But anyway, I got there, and I walked in, and I sat down, and sure enough, people started walking in. They're walking in twos and threes, guys and gals, and everybody knows everybody because they've been taking classes for 2 years. So they're all walking in, and as they're walking in, they look over at me like, who's that? And then, some of them sat over there, and some of them sat over here, and some of them sat over there, and sat over here. And by the time the class was about to start, this is no joke, every seat was full except for the one in front of me, the one beside me, the one over here, and the one right behind me. I was like, man, I don't know what's going on, what's happening. And all of a sudden, class is about to start, and this one guy comes walking in. It's the last guy that comes walking in. And I'm telling you, man, he had it together. I mean, he was pressed, clean shirt, just right, earring in, necklace on, things going on, every hair in place, had the watch on, had the bling. He walking in, he's like, and he's looking around, looked at the best looking girl in the place, looks at her, comes around. He didn't have anywhere to sit but beside me, okay? So he comes over, he sits beside me, he looks over at me, he's starting to check up one side and down the other, and I'm thinking, man, I gotta figure this out. The guy's name was Rayford Nugent, no relation. Rayford Nugent. He sits down beside me, and he looks at me, and he goes, "Sup?" And I looked back at him, I said, "Sup?" I don't even know what that meant, but he said it, I said it. I didn't know if we were going to dinner later or what, but sup. And all of a sudden, he was obviously the man, because everybody was like, man, Rayford must know the guy. He's cool. It's cool if he knows him. He's cool. And all of a sudden, afterwards, we got up and we walked out. We started talking about sports, started talking about basketball. Come to find out, he's on this intramural team. I played on his team. We became, over the next 2 years, best friends. If there was a sport to be had, everything from golf to football to basketball to frisbee, you name it, we did it together. Every single sport there was. And by the next year, I was dating my wife at the time, and my wife, she was my fiance at the time. We got married my junior year, my senior year. We lived on campus in married housing, and he was just a part of all that, a big part of all that. He knew everything about me. I'd talk to him about my wife. I'd talk about my mom and dad. I'd talk about this, and he would always afterwards, we'd be playing ball. He'd say, hey, man, let's go catch a couple beers together. And I'd say, hey, man, you go ahead. I'm going to head home to the wife, and, man, I got a little study to do. He goes, all right, man, that's cool. Go on. And he'd go do his thing. And on Sunday, he'd say, hey, man, hey, we're going to play a little golf. Why don't you come play golf with us Sunday morning? I said, man, I'd love to, but I'm heading down to the church house. But I appreciate it, man. You go ahead. Have a good time. He goes, okay, buddy, that's good. I got you. And you know what? I never judged Rayford for who he was. He was just cool, man. He was just my man. I just wanted to love him, and he never judged me for who I was. He never treated me any differently because I wouldn't drink with him or because I wouldn't go to church with him, couldn't do these things. He just said, yeah, that's cool, man, whatever, that's good. You do your thing, I'll do mine. It's okay. And we'd go and do different things together. It was great. But for the next 2 years, we got closer and closer and closer. And it was about time to graduate. I got down to my last semester, and I got a phone call from First Baptist Church in Spartanburg, South Carolina, just down the street right here. And this church called me up, and they said, hey, we want you to come and be our minister of recreation. I was so excited. I told my wife, I said, babe, this is everything I've ever wanted, man. I'm going to be a minister of recreation at a church. This is going to be awesome, man. I'm going to get the opportunity to use sports as a tool to share the love of Jesus Christ with other people. And I no more got those words off of my lips, and I realized, man, I have been spending the last 2 years doing nothing but sports with Rayford, and I've never shared Jesus with him. And my wife said, well, you certainly can't go up there to that church and talk about being a minister of recreation until you share Jesus with him. And, man, I'm telling you what, we literally were moving the next day. And I went out and I said, we got to pack up first. And I went out and got a U-Haul, and I came and I hooked it up to our car, and we packed up everything we had. And about 30 minutes later, I started looking for Rayford because that's about all we had, about 30 minutes worth of stuff. And so the next morning, I had a final exam, and I went down, and I'm looking for Rayford. And we had a final. We always studied together, and so I went to the library and I sat down with him, and I said, Rayford, I got to talk to you about something. He said, what is it? He said, what are you doing after graduation? He said, man, I'm going to work at the family store. I'm selling men's clothes. I said, man, that's awesome. He said, what are you going to do? I said, you're not going to believe this. I said, man, I'm going to be a minister of recreation in Spartanburg, South Carolina. He said, a what? Why in the world would you want to work at a church? And I said, thank you. Here we go. Man, I'm telling you, I jumped in there. I pulled out the Roman Road, the wordless book, every Bible verse you could imagine, everything my mom had ever told me, every Bible school thing I'd ever done. I laid it out in 6 different ways, 7 different ways. Shit came out from every different direction. And when I got done, I was almost sweating. I'd laid out every verse I'd ever seen in my life. I'd opened the Bible, flipped through it in every different way you could possibly imagine. When I got done, and Rayford's listened intently to this whole thing. And when I got done, I said, so you see, Rayford, Jesus Christ is the most important thing in my life. Whew, and I'm like, that's what I'm talking about. And I said, what do you think about that, Rayford? And he said, hey, man, let me just ask you a question. And I'm telling you, it wasn't in an ugly way or a unkind way. It was out of nothing but sheer curiosity. He looked at me and he said, Caz, he said, man, I've known you for 2 years. Man, I know everything about your 2 brothers and your sister and their families, and I know everything about your dog. I know about your wife. I know about your family. I know about your dad and your mom. He said, now, if this is the most important thing in your life, why did it take you 2 years to tell me about it? And I said, no, hold on just a second, Rayford. I said, that is nobody's fault but mine. I said, man, listen, we have always been great friends. He said, no, man, hey, it's no problem. I was just kind of curious. Why? I said, listen, you need to know this is the most important thing in my life. He said, hold it right there. He said, I'm really happy for you that you need Jesus. He said, but I'm going to tell you something. I don't need your Jesus. I got it together. I know you might need him, but I don't need him. I said, Rayford, you don't understand. He said, no, you don't understand. He said, let's just drop it. I'm going to tell you, I got up the next morning. I got in that car, and I drove up here to Spartanburg, South Carolina with Rayford in the rear view of my car, rear view window of my car, having to live with the fact that I never shared Jesus with him for those next 2 years. And I became aware of the fact that I was living in a world where it was all about me. One of my favorite Bible verses, my life verse, is Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ. You know really what that first part of that verse means? I have been crucified with Christ. It's all about me. You know, there's only 2 kind of people in this whole world. It's those that don't have any idea who Jesus is and those who are believers that have given their life over to him. Those who have given their life over to him and those who are still searching for the truth, and they don't really know that they're searching for the truth. But those that are still searching for the truth, the reality of it is it's all about me. That's all they're thinking. It's all about me. And so when you're sitting there thinking it's all about me, that's really the right mindset for him, because he doesn't know any different, because he's still searching for the truth. But for me, it was a point of awareness that I was still thinking about me. I was making all my decisions about me. I became aware of the fact that this was all about me, and I had to live with that for years and years. And I remember 5 years later, I got to see him again. I went by to see him, and I walked in the door. I wasn't about to let this happen. Within 30 seconds, I said, "Hey, man, can I talk to you about Jesus?" He said, "I don't need your Jesus." 5 years after that, "I don't need your Jesus." This had gone on for 10 years. I've lived with the fact that I never shared Jesus with Rayford when I should have, because I was thinking more about me. Let me just tell you something. That awareness has done something inside of me, like a lot of other things, but that awareness, your awareness, when you become aware of things like that in your life, it leads to the second part of the circle. It leads to a passion. It creates a passion within you that you just can't stop. And Webster will tell you that a passion is a powerful and compelling emotion or feeling that comes from many forms. And let me just tell you what those things are. Have you ever been passionate about something that you love? You ever been passionate about something that you hate? You ever been passionate about something that is something that makes you happy, or something that makes you sad? You ever been passionate about something that's joyful to you? Been passionate about something that brings great anger to you? Those things are any kind of passion. And let me tell you, every single one of these things comes in one category or another. They're either in the category of something mentally, athletically, spiritually, or socially. We've all been there. We got mental things that just we get real passionate about. We got athletic things that we get real passionate about. We could run down that path all day. We got spiritual things that get us passionate. Social things that get us passionate. Let me just tell you one of my favorite passionate stories, if I can. I'm on the way home one time in the airport, and I'm flying from Texas. I get to Atlanta, and as soon as I land, the storm comes running through. Any of you guys that fly and travel a lot, it happens all the time in Atlanta. And man, you just look out the windows, and you just know, man, delay is on. It is on, and if it looks like they're going to delay more than 3 or 4 hours, I'll just rent a car and come home, because I can be here in 2.5 hours. And so I don't do it very often, but if that's what's going to happen, I'll wait it out a little bit. But if it's going to get long, I'm just going to rent a car. And so I'm looking out the window, and I'm seeing what's going on. And I'm walking up to my gate, and sure enough, they say, "Ladies and gentlemen, we got a little weather storm come in, and we're going to be a little delayed. We'll let you know in the progress in this next 15, 20 minutes. And I'm thinking, all right, I'm going to wait this out a little bit. And as I'm walking, I think I'm going to go over and sit down. And I look over on the side. And this is several years ago. So you'll understand in just a second. Several years ago, I look over, and there's this dude that's laid back, and he's got on all camo. He's got on sunglasses, camo hat, and he's kicked back, and he's laid back. He's got his feet propped up on his little suitcase right there. And I thought, oh, man, that is either the lead singer for ZZ Top, or that is Phil Robertson right there. And I said, I can't stand it. I got to go over and see. I walked over to him, and there was Miss Kay sitting right beside him. And I said, "Excuse me, sir." I said, "You are either the lead singer for ZZ Top, or you are Phil Robertson. You are the Duck Commander." And he pulls his sunglasses down. He goes, "Boom, boom, boom." Now, this is before Duck Dynasty. So, before Duck Dynasty, it was a serious show. It was a hunting show. It was all about how to get ducks, right? And so I'm up there, and I'm sitting down with this guy, and I know that all my hunting buddies, they're not going to believe this. I'm sitting down with the dude from Duck Dynasty, man. This is, of course, it wasn't even Duck Dynasty then. Like I said, he was the Duck Commander. And he was doing this stuff. He said it was the craziest thing. He started telling me stuff. And I said, "Man, I'm telling you, I have never gotten one of your duck calls, but I'd love to know how to do that." He leans up, starts teaching me how to do duck calls. And he starts telling me doing all this stuff, and we get to laughing and cutting up, and I can tell he's just, just wanting to kind of be by himself. And I said, "Listen, I'm so sorry. I've taken way too much of your time. I'm going to let you rest." And so as I'm looking over, they said, "Man, we're going to be delayed another 45 minutes at least. We'll keep you posted on what's going on." And I look down, and I go, "That's it, man. I'm renting a car. I'm out of here." And so as I'm walking back by from the airport, the gate, I'm walking back by there, I hear him look over at his wife and say, "Miss Kay, call the church and tell them we're not going to make it. We're headed home." And I stopped and I went, "Excuse me, Mr. Duck Commander." I said, "Where exactly are you headed to?" He said, "Well, I was going to Anderson South Carolina. I'm supposed to be preaching at a church there, but we're never going to make it on time. I said, well, I've just rented a car, and I'm on my way to Spartanburg, South Carolina. I'd love to tell you. He says, Miss Kay, get your bags. We're riding with Caz. Yes, sir, buddy. 2.5 hours with the duck commander in my car. Now, let me just tell you, old Phil did me wrong, okay? Because what he did is got in the back, took a nap, and left me up there with Miss Kay. Y'all have seen the episode before. Woo! Man, she can go. I mean, go and go. 6 different conversations at one time, man. I was like, what in the world? And finally I said, do you think that Phil's hungry? She goes, yeah, he probably is. We ought to pull over. So I pulled over to Chick-fil-A just to wake him up. And we pull over to Chick-fil-A and we walk in there to get something. And I'm telling you, there's a family sitting there. There's a guy sitting there, a dad and his wife and a little boy and a little girl, and they're sitting there. And as we walk in the door, the guy's sitting there at the table. He's got on camo and he's got on glasses and that kind of stuff. He didn't even budge. He's in the middle of eating his sandwich. He just looks up and he goes, boom, 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 and went right back to eating, just like that. And he looks at me and goes, just some of my fans. Now this guy, let me just tell you, we got back in the car and we're on our way. And we're headed to up to Anderson for me to drop him off. And as we're sitting there, we're talking, and I'm just asking him. I'm saying, listen, tell me how things are going. How did you get into this whole duck commander thing? He said, Caz, you're not gonna believe it. He said, I used to play football. Y'all probably heard this story. He said, there's a guy named Terry Bradshaw who used to play behind me, and he used to get so mad because he'd go to practice and work out, and I just didn't like to go to practice. I'd just play in the games. And he said, he'd always ask me, he said, Phil, where you been? He said, well, I've been duck hunting. He said, man, are you kidding me? He said, you got to come to practice. He said, well, apparently I don't. He said, I just, like to come to the games. He said, let me ask you something, Terry. He said, what's your biggest passion? He said, football. He said, what's yours? I said, ducks. He said, look, you go for the Bucks, I'll go for the ducks. And he quit. He walked away. And most people don't know, as great as an athlete as Phil Robertson was, he wasn't there on an athletic scholarship. He was there on an academic scholarship. Man, smart as a whip. And he and Miss Kay, they got married, but he was lost as a goose. And what happened was Miss Kay kept working on him. He told me about how he asked Jesus to come into his heart. And he said, I just wanted to work on these ducks and making these things. He said, I started making my own duck calls. And he said, my wife was working for this man, and she was the administrative assistant for him. And as she was working for him one time, he looked at her and said, hey, I got to take a bunch of fellas out to go do some duck hunting. And he said, I want you to find somebody that knows how to call in ducks. And she said, well, that'll be easy. My husband's the best duck caller in town. And she said, well, line him up. And so sure enough, a couple weeks later, took him out to go duck hunting. And I mean, he got out there and he was calling in the ducks from everybody. They're all but landing in their lap. And this guy was shooting them all over the place. And the guy looked at him, was all over. He said, where did you get that duck call? He said, man, that is the nicest thing I've ever seen in my life. He said, well, I made it. He said, well, son, you can make some money selling them things. He said, well, I got to have a bunch of money first. He said, how much do you need? And he told him, and he said, well, I'll write you a check for it. And when you make enough money, just write it back and we'll be done. He goes, okay, I'll do that. Man wrote him a big old check, and he starts this whole thing. And when he made enough money, he just wrote him a check back. And that's how the whole thing started. He said, before too long, he said, this guy that my wife used to work for said, you ought to get this guy to come down and speak at the Ducks Unlimited at the Superdome in New Orleans. And so they called him up and they had him come down there, and he was just kind of a side note speaker, kind of a nobody guy. And he was sitting over there, and he walked up on stage. So I walked up on the stage and it said, Ducks Unlimited, sponsored by Budweiser. He said, I stood up there and he says, I was scared to death. And he said, all I knew to do was just pull out my duck calls and tell a couple of funny stories about my crazy sons and my uncle and crazy things like that. And he said, I started just telling stories, and man, they all got to roaring and laughing. He said, they gave me 15 minutes. When I got done, they gave me a standing ovation. He said, I walked off and the president came over and intercepted me. He said, hey, that's the best speaker we've ever had. He says, you got anything else? He says, yeah, I got some more. He says, well, get on up there and do some more. He says, what do you want me to talk about? He said, anything you want. He said, okay. He said, Miss Kay, give me my Bible. And he picked up his Bible, his microphone. And he walks over there and he starts talking about Jesus. He stood up there and he says, hey, I want to tell you, I'm having a good time here tonight. Everybody's like, woo! He says, I got some incredible news for you. They're like, woo! He said, about 95% of y'all are going to hell. He said, you could have heard a pin drop in that place. He said, man, I opened it up and I started sharing the love of Jesus with them. I started rolling them out, and I told them they needed to ask Jesus to come into their heart so that they could spend eternity with him. He said, when I got done, I closed the book, and he said, that's the gospel according to Jesus Christ. Sponsored by Budweiser. Man, I'm telling you, I'm dying laughing by this time. I'm riding down the car. This is the funniest thing I've ever seen. He said, I got home that night, and he said they called me the next morning and asked me if I'd come back and speak the next year at the Duck. He said, they want me to be a main speaker. I said, well, I'd love to come back. That's more fun I've ever had. He said, now here's the thing, Phil. You can't talk about Jesus. He said, well, then I'm really not interested. Thank you very much for calling. And he hangs up. He said about 30 minutes later, the president called back. He says, I understand you're not interested in coming back. He said, I'd love to come back. He said, but I want to talk about Jesus. He said, Phil, you talk about whatever you want. He said, now I get to go to the Ducks Unlimited and share Jesus every year. He said, I've been preaching every Sunday since then. Man, what if he would have said, okay, just write me a check and I'll talk about ducks. But God said, whatever I tell you to do, what? Whatever I tell you to do, man, he became aware of the fact that God gave him a gift by making duck calls. And that passion, that awareness turned into a passion. And that passion, I'm just going to tell you, is incredible because let me tell you something about passion. Passion is extremely contagious. It's extremely motivating. It's extremely inspiring. But the main thing about passion is that is it easily transferable. I'm telling you, that guy has been preaching ever since. I'll never forget the last thing he said to me before he got out of the car. We had about 10 minutes after he told me all these stories. My eyes were popping out of my head. And like I said, this is several years ago. He said, Caz, you're not going to believe this. He said, they're thinking about doing a reality show with our family. How crazy is that? Man. I'm telling you, most unbelievable thing. But that passion, let me just tell you what happens when you become aware of things going on in your life. That awareness leads to a passion. And that passion obviously quickly leads to a vision. It leads to a vision. And here's the thing about it. Webster will tell you that vision is the ability to see. But I want to tell you what I think is my definition of God's vision. A vision is God's answer to a prior problem. When God makes you aware of something and he makes you passionate about something, he's going to give you his vision for something. Not my vision. It's not just the ability to be able to see what's in front of me. And it's not just a dream. It's not just something like that. It's his vision. Ephesians 2:10 says this, I have been crucified with Christ. That's Galatians 2:20. It says, we are God's workmanship. We are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works that God planned in advance for us to do. Not that I planned, but God planned in advance for us to do. I don't know about you, but let me just tell you something. All too often, I've been mixed up in the reality of saying, I got this idea, I got this thought, I got this plan. Woo, that looks good. God, come here, check this out. You're not going to believe this. You probably never thought of this. Look at here. Have you ever started to work on something, or pull something together and say, God, come here, I want you to check out what I did? A lot of times people say, well, man, I want to be a part of a vision. I want to be a part of what God's planned a long time ago. Let me just tell you, you don't have to go searching for God's vision. God's vision is going to come searching for you. The difference between my personal dream, the difference between your personal dream, the difference between my ideas and his ideas, the difference between the best, the vision that God gives you, the vision is the difference between the best that you can do and the very best that God can do. The very best that I could do and the very best that God can do. And that's a big difference. That's what a vision is. When God does it, it's way bigger than anything we ever imagined. If you come up with it, you might be able to come up with a way to figure it out. And if you can come up with a way to figure it out, let me just tell you, that's probably not God's vision. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it might be a great thing. But I'm just telling you, it's not going to be something that only he and he alone can get the glory and the honor and the praise for. And so here's the deal. It doesn't matter what it is that you're passionate about. It doesn't matter what it is that you become aware of. It doesn't matter what it is. When God gives you a vision, he might give you a vision to go out and make movies. How crazy would that be? He might give you a vision to go out and do sports and recreation in your church. How crazy would that be? He might give you a vision to do ministry through magic. How crazy would that be? He might give you a vision to do ministry by walking around on stilts and juggling and doing some kind of, who knows all the different things that happen. I walk over there and I think about all the different ways that God has used his vision to speak into people's life. Let me just tell you something that's crazy about all this. Every one of those things right there, awareness, passion, and vision. Do you realize that in every single one of those situations, there is nothing that you need to do to make that happen? None of these require anything from you whatsoever. And all three of those things, it is not about you pursuing it, it's about God pursuing you. And He is constantly pursuing us to further His kingdom. It is all about how we react to that. The first part of this is a reaction mode. The awareness and the passion and the vision, we react to that. Go ahead and put that up there if you will, reaction. And so here's what's interesting about that. It's Him pursuing us. And when we get to this point right here, in this circle of ministry opportunity, we become aware of something. It just happens to us. We become passionate. We didn't have to try to become passionate. It just happened. We got passionate. And when you get passionate, if you'll allow Him, if you'll stop long enough, God will give you a vision that He's done, and we're reacting to our awareness. We're reacting to our passion, and we're reacting to the vision that God gave us. And when that happens, we begin to move into the next phase. And when you begin to move into the next phase, it stops being reaction and it starts becoming action. We have to act on this. And when you get to that point of vision, every time God gives you a vision, I'm going to tell you what's going to come next. Be ready. Here it comes. Get ready for what I'm about to tell you. When you get to this point, you're going to come to a fork in the road called faith or fear. Faith or fear. And so I'm going to give you the definition of both so you can figure this out. I'm going to give you the definition of faith first. Faith is the belief in something that you cannot see is going to happen. It's the belief in something you cannot see is going to happen. Let me give you a definition of fear. It's the belief in something you cannot see is going to happen. It's the belief in something you cannot see is going to happen, but the fork is there. And the question is, are you going to believe what it is that God is saying to you in this vision, or are you going to believe what the world is going to say to you and say, that's impossible, you can never do it? That's the craziest thing I ever heard. That's the stupidest thing I ever heard. You don't want to be available to that. You need to be thinking about this. You don't need to do that. You need to do faith or fear. Both of them are the belief in something that you cannot see is going to happen. And I'm going to tell you something. I am convinced that it has probably happened to multiple people in this room, that if God has asked you to do something, and when God asks you to do something, Jesus' mother gave us the perfect example when she said, whatever He tells you to do, but it's going to take faith to do that. And I love what Henry Blackaby says about this. He says, we don't hardly ever get the opportunity to see the evidence of what we believe until after we have obeyed. We don't get to see the evidence of our faith until after we have obeyed. And so here's the second part of that. Galatians 2:20, it says, I have been crucified with Christ. It's all about me. Some of y'all probably read Rick Warren's book, in the very first page, the very first chapter, the very first line, this is what it says. It's not about you anymore. Because see, that's what happens in the second part of that verse. I've been crucified with Christ, but it is no longer I who live. It is Christ who lives in me. And the life which I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me while I was still a sinner and gave His life for me. What happens in that moment when we have to act? We become aware, we become passionate, we get this point that God gives us a vision, and it's time for us now to step out there and act. And the first thing that we have to do when we have to act is we have to get ready. It's all about readiness. The readiness to be able to move on what it is that God's going to do through that vision that He gave you because you became passionate and because He made you aware of something He wants you to do for Him when you get ready to step out there and do that. Probably one of the greatest examples of this was my own mom. You can put the next one up there, readiness. So my mom passed away in September 6th of last year, so a little over a year ago. And it was about 4 or 5, maybe 2 months ago, right before that, I got a phone call from my brother, and his daughter was getting married, my niece, and when my mom was getting ready, she had her long dress on, and she was getting altered, and she stood up on one of those little boxes, where they alter the dress, and then when they got done altering the dress, she went to step off, and she fell off, and she broke her hip. And so she couldn't go to the wedding. And my brother said, hey, when you come down, will you do me a favor and go over and see Mom at the hospital and just comfort her and tell her that we'll get her a DVD and video and pictures. We'll show her everything. It'll be just like she was there. And I said, yeah, man, I'll be glad to do that. I'll be glad to do that. And so I go down there a couple days before the wedding, and Mom had gotten really, really sick because she had a lot of fluid building up on her lungs and a lot of different things like that. And so I got down there, and I reached over, and I grabbed her by the hand, and I was just loving on her and telling her how glad I was to be with her. And she looks at me, and she says, okay. She says, Gregory, that's my real name. She didn't ever call me Caz. She said, I didn't name you that, I'm calling you Gregory. So, Gregory, come here. She says, come here. And I said, what is it? She goes, I need to tell you something. I said, what is it, Mom? She goes, don't be mad at me. I said, I'm not going to be mad at you, Mama. What is it? And she said, I'm ready to go home. I'm ready to go be with Jesus. I said, Mom, that's okay. I understand. She said, I just don't know what good I am here right now. I'm ready to go home. I said, I understand that, Mama. She said, but if I'm not going home, I just want him to give me something to do for him. I said, well, I understand that too. She said, so I'm ready. Either way, I'm ready, but I want something to do. So before too long, we had to move her from there. We end up going to hospice. We're in hospice, and fast forward a little bit, we're getting down to the final days of her life, and I'm in the room again with her by herself, and just me and her, and I'm staring at her, and I'm talking to her, and she's in between, sucking on ice cream and popsicles and that kind of stuff. And just in some of her final breaths in her last days, she looks at me and she says, Gregory, are they saying this is my deathbed? And I said, yeah, Mom, they're saying this is your deathbed. She said, well, then move me to the chair. I got some things to do. Get me off the deathbed for a minute. And so we did. We picked her up, moved her over to the chair. And she made us go out. She said, I want you to get all the tracts I got at home, and I want every single person in this hospice to make sure they got a tract. And I want to know that everybody's got one. And we started handing them out. Everybody's got a tract. Everybody's out there. Everybody's got a tract. We gave everybody one, and all these different people had them. So we go another couple of days, and she's back in the bed, and she's taking her last breaths. And finally, the doctor is coming in just to check her pulse and her breathing to see if she's going to make it for any more time at all. She's going to be with us anymore. We're all sitting around waiting for her to go to be with Jesus. And this is what she says to the doctor. She said, Doctor, come here. Did you get one of those tracts? And he'd kind of taken it and thrown it aside many times. And he knew that she's just waiting for the right things for her before she could go home. Sir, come here. Did you get one of those tracts? He said, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, Miss Ethel, I got one. And she pulls him in and she says, well, have you read it yet? See, my mama moved quickly from readiness to intentionality. She decided she was going to be intentional up into her very last breath of sharing Jesus Christ with other people. Can I just tell you something? As long as you're on this ministry opportunity circle, if you're not intentional, nothing's going to happen. I don't care what you've been made aware of. I don't become what you become passionate about. I don't care what vision God has given to you. All those are things about Him pursuing you. But next, you got to move things into action. You got to get ready. And the problem in our church today, the problem in the body of Christ today, the problem with the half of this world that are already believers about trying to share the love of Jesus Christ with those who are searching for the truth is that this half of the people that live out here have stopped being intentional about sharing Jesus with lost people. And I don't care what it is He asks you to do. But whatever He asks you to do, I don't know what your microphone is. Sports, recreation, movies, whatever it is. I don't know what it is. But God has given you gifts and talents that He wants you to use to share His name with other people. He has made you aware of something. He's given you a passion for something. And if you will be still and listen, He will give you a vision for something unique to you. And at that moment, it's time to act. Faith or fear. And when you act, you'd better get ready. And the best way for you to get ready is by being intentional. And if you will be intentional, guess what happens? you begin to make a whole lot more people aware of who Jesus is. And all of a sudden, they'll become passionate, and they get a vision. And this circle continues, and we will be able to make this circle bigger and bigger. And together, this body of Christ, this army, can share the love of Jesus Christ in more than we ever have before. But we must get intentional. So my dear friends, when you leave this place, if you don't remember anything I've said here tonight, whatever he tells you to do, God bless you. Have a super day.